Okay, well, welcome back for our last session this week. And in this session, we're going to be talking about Oneism versus Twoism, pagan revival in the modern world. And I will tell you in advance that I'm depending very heavily on the work of my very dear friend, my very respected mentor, the man I think is, if I try to ask who is on the absolute cutting edge of evangelical Protestant understanding of what is happening to culture in Western civilization and especially in America today, it is my friend Peter Jones. Dr. Peter Jones is Emeritus Professor of New Testament at Westminster Theological Seminary, Escondido, California. He's British. He grew up in England, and in fact, he was a friend of John Lennon, one of the Beatles. They grew up in the same neighborhood together, used to play together, played guitar together, and so on, and maintained contact after their graduating from high school, although obviously they went different paths. Peter has been very interested in pop culture, in just underlying currents in the culture all his life. He was a professor for quite a while at Reformed Theological Seminary in Aix-en-Provence in France. And in his work as a New Testament scholar, he especially focused on the New Testament interaction with nascent, that is, early, just beginning to form Gnostic movements. And then he went on to study the actual full-blown Gnosticism of the 2nd and 3rd centuries and became one of the world's leading authorities on ancient Gnosticism. And then he really began to be very interested in how Gnosticism was reviving in the modern New Age movement. He wrote a couple of books about the New Age movement and so on. So he's been seeing how what we really are observing around us religiously is not new. It is a return to very old sorts of thinking. In around 1988, 1990, something like that, Peter moved to the United States to become a professor at Westminster Seminary, Escondido. And he was shocked when he came to the United States. He had been here before in doing his PhD studies at Westminster in Philadelphia, but had been out of the United States for a couple of decades or so, several decades even, I think. And he was just simply amazed at the amount of transformation of American culture, of American discourse, not just in the surrounding culture, but in the churches as well. And he saw the huge extent to which the churches were being leavened by the surrounding world rather than leavening the world. And so he's really focused on how the world's thought penetrates the church, and he wants to try to help to wake the church up to those sorts of things. He not too long before he retired from teaching at Westminster Escondido, he started a ministry that was, no, now I've actually forgotten the name of the ministry, what it was before, but he changed its name to Truth X Change. That's truth and then an X and then change.org. Truth Exchange gets its name from the fact that we are in the process of exchanging the truth of God for a lie. He takes the name right out of Romans chapter 1. And he's focusing on how Eastern pantheistic mysticism is displacing biblical Christian dualist worldview, creator-creature distinction worldview, and a biblical Christian worldview of rationality, of a comprehensible, objective external world versus an incomprehensible, mysterious world that may very well be nothing but our own minds. Plural? Should that be plural? or should it just be mind? Because really everything is one. So he's developed this way of looking at things, at competing religious claims, by recognizing that all of them really fall into one of two categories: oneism or twoism. That is, oneism says all reality is basically one. It's the universe. Now, you might think that the universe is atoms and energy, matter and energy in motion, or you might think that the universe is the divine monad, the undivided world soul, in which all appearance of distinctions is mere illusion, maya, and nirvana, the complete obliteration of all impression of distinctions, is the real goal. So your oneist position might be either of those two radically different positions, but at root, they are both oneist. They are both saying the world is all there is. There is not a creator distinct from the world. And so he's wanting to help people to recognize how deeply some of the differences confronting us now in our culture and in our religious discourse, how deeply those roots run, all the way to the point of just simply answering the question, is reality one or is reality two? Right? So now I am going to be depending an awful lot, and in fact I'm going to be working from this as I speak to you today, this little book, Only Two Religions. And the book is actually a training manual for using a little witnessing tool that Peter and his folks at Truth Exchange have developed. The cover just simply says, Only Two Religions. You open it up, and you get this: one or two, right? You open that left side, and it tells you about oneism. Oneism, all is one. We worship and serve creation as divine. All distinctions must be eliminated. Through enlightenment, we discover that we also are divine. That's the fundamental idea of oneism. And that, by the way, is equally applicable to so-called secular, atheistic, modernist Enlightenment thought, secular humanism, as it is to Hinduism or Buddhism or shamanism. They all wind up saying basically this same thing. Because if you're a secular, atheist, humanist, what is ultimate reality? The world, right? And so what should be your ultimate concern? The world. By the world, I don't mean just simply the earth, but the cosmos, the whole cosmos, right? So that should be your ultimate concern. And that's actually one of the definitions of God used by some philosophers. For instance, Paul Tillich, the liberal Christian, liberal Protestant, not sure I can really call him Christian, but Paul Tillich defined God as one's ultimate concern. Whatever is one's ultimate concern is God to him. And then if you open the other side, you get Twoism. And in Twoism, all is two. We worship and serve the eternal personal creator of all things. God alone is divine and is distinct from his creation, yet through his Son Jesus, he is in loving communion with it. So you get very different basic pictures of what reality is all about. Then you open the whole thing out like this, and you have on one side here an enlargement of what oneism is all about. All is one. All is one and everything is divine. There is no external God. Spirituality is in ourselves and in the universe around us. Humanity is one. Everyone shares in the divine power. If we all unite, we can bring the world to a new level of happiness and peace. Religions are one. Each religion has some of the truth. If we bring them all together, we will discover real spirituality. Peter is fond of talking about one of the illustrations that one will see, a graphic, is that religions are like a pizza pie, round, and it's cut into a bunch of pieces. And yeah, they seem far apart from each other out at the crust. But the crust is the dry, hard, not so appetizing part. But you move in toward the point of each piece of pizza and you discover they all meet at the same point in the middle. And instead of being the dry, hard crust, that's the soft, moist part, that's the tender part where all the flavors come together. Everything is richly mixed. That's what the world's religions are all about. Forget about the dry crust out at the edges. It's the heart of religion. They're all fundamentally one. What is the problem for the world? Well, the problem is we need to remember that we are one. We need to remember that we are one. Black and white distinctions keep us from unity and from taking the world to the next level of spirituality. Consequently, of course, we must all become relativists. Pardon me. We must all become relativists because we don't want black and white distinctions, do we? We want to blur the distinctions because the distinctions aren't real anyway. They're only illusion. So the solution, we look within ourselves to find power, and unifying balance. We become spiritual as we experience the unity of all things and lose ourselves in the all. So there you've got a basic summary of what Oneism is all about. And you can find that basic summary in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, in Confucianism, in Native American religion, in indigenous tribal religions throughout Africa and Latin America and Asia. It's all there. But then the option is Twoism. And in Twoism, all is two. There are two kinds of reality, God and creation. God is eternal, triune, personal, loving, and awesome. He made everything else that exists. And by the way, he made it out of nothing, right? So we're not pantheists, we're not panentheists, we're not animists or spiritists. We are twoists, we are biblical theists. Humanity is two. There are two kinds of people, those who are for God and those who are against him. There is no neutral ground. Jesus said, whoever is not for me is against me. Religions are two. Spirituality means worship and service. We worship and serve either God or something created. And the problem is that we reject God's authority and his definition of the world and of who we are. We don't live by his laws, and we refuse his solution for our rebellion. You notice he hasn't named the gospel there yet. He said that there's a solution. We refuse his solution. That's the problem. Now we come to the solution itself. If we look to God in repentance and accept Jesus' sacrifice for us, we discover the deep love of God our Father by the power of his Spirit, while keeping our identity. We aren't absorbed into the all. We remain who we are, but we are reconciled to God. So that's his little tool, and it doesn't explain the gospel. It doesn't take a person through a step-by-step understanding. Part of why that is so is that Peter recognizes that for people who are so diametrically outside of a biblical framework of thinking, you have to address these underlying issues first before God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life, means anything at all, makes any sense, right? So this book then guides people through how to understand the implications of oneism and twoism in various aspects of life, and how to move people through that sequence from all is one, to humanity is one, to religions are one, to the problem, to the solution, versus the biblical sequence. All is two, humanity is two, religions are two. The problem is not Maya, the problem is our rebellion against God, and the solution, repentance, salvation by faith in Christ. Right? So it's that. But what the book does is to help Christians to become sensitive observers of the world around us through media, through our walking through grocery stores or whatever in the surrounding community, and through conversations with non-believers out there. So that's actually going to form the outline, the structure for what I have to say right now. But I want to start where Peter does consistently, and that is with the fact that the Apostle Paul confronted the same thing. And he wrote about it very explicitly. I just realized I changed the PowerPoint on my computer here, but not up there. I can ignore this, but Paul addressed this explicitly in Romans 1. What we are encountering is essentially the same world that Paul encountered back in the first century. It is coming back with a vengeance. And we need to look at how Paul dealt with his encounter with that world, how he understood it. So I want us to just look at Romans 1, verses 16 through 32. Paul writes there, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, to the one who grew up under the Old Testament history and law and literature, who got a good picture of God as the creator. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, who has a twoist worldview, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, the one who didn't grow up with that kind of a worldview, who didn't understand that God is separate from his creation, distinct from it, who sees the universe itself as eternal, and if they're gods in it, well, they're really basically supersized humans with all the human foibles and weaknesses. I mean, if you read Greek mythology, you see the gods fighting with each other. They're petty, they're gossips, they're vindictive toward each other over the silliest things, and I mean, this is what it's about. But they're all just part of the world. They don't stand outside of the world. No one of them stands outside of the world. And they are subordinate to the world as a whole. So there's the oneist mentality. And so Paul insists that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to people from either world, from either culture. For in it, that is the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith, that should be from faith to faith. Well, actually, I suppose perhaps in the ESV, maybe it does read for faith. It could be. Anyway, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith, I'll read it in my customary way, to faith. That is beginning to end. You start with faith, you end with faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. How do we live in Christ? Not by our own struggles, not by our striving, not by our efforts, not by our works, but by faith. And then the first word of the next part of the next passage, and I intentionally started at verse 16, though most people will usually start at verse 18. But 18 begins with that word for. So everything that follows is reason for what he just said. What he just asserted was that the righteous shall live by faith, not by works. That part was implicit. But what was explicit is the righteous shall live by faith. 4 introduces what actually goes not just from 118 through 32, but that 4 introduces a whole argument that runs from verse 18 all the way through to chapter 3, verse 21, where Paul tells us that by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. And in the interim there, first of all here in the second half of chapter 1, Paul describes the general condition of mankind. Mankind that has turned away from God and rejected the transcendent creator who is distinct from his universe and exchanged him for an image made like to things that are not transcendent, things that are just part of the world. So he's going to give us a quick rundown of what happens with people like that. And then in chapter 2, he starts telling us about, he addresses the Jew. You know, is this true for Jews? I'm sorry, the first part of chapter 2, he addresses the Gentiles, the Oneists, right? Well, is this true for the Oneists? Yes, indeed, and he tells us all about that. The second part of chapter 2, he addresses the Jew, the Twoist. Is this true for the Twoist? Yes, indeed. All of what I've written here in Romans 1, 18 through 32 applies to both of them. And then in the first part of chapter 3, he combines the two together. It's like he's gone round in a circle. He says here in chapter 1, everybody is this way. In chapter 2, first he addresses the fact that Gentiles are that way. Then he addresses the fact that Jews are that way. And so he's come right back full circle to saying everybody's that way. So you get, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So that 4 there, why is it there? It's because Paul is saying it is impossible for us to be justified by anything but faith, precisely because we're all such sinners. You notice that he's already set up what is the problem. The problem that we face is our rebellion against God that makes it impossible for us to be righteous in his sight by our own good deeds. So he's already set the problem in front of us. Here's why the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Not to everyone who does right, not to everyone who satisfies God's requirements, but to everyone who believes. Here is why the righteous live by faith, not by some good works that they would do. It's because the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, which he is then going to argue describes everybody. So you want to be right with God, you want to be reconciled with God, you want peace of mind, peace of heart. You can't do it by your works because God's already angry with you, because you have failed to live according to his law. So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. It's not that they don't know it. They know it and they don't like it, so they intentionally try to hold it down. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Now that very concept, the creation of the world, would have been totally familiar to the Jewish readers, but unfamiliar to the Gentiles of his day, to the Greeks, to the Romans. created? The creation of the world? They all believed the world was eternal, as do Hindus, as do Buddhists. There may be cycles of repeated events, but the world has always been and always will be. And it's interesting that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you had a very concerted attempt on the part of a number of physicists and astronomers, and especially cosmologists, to come up with a theory that would affirm the eternity of the universe. They were trying desperately to find some way within the laws of physics to justify asserting that the universe had been around forever. Under the Christian worldview that had dominated Western culture for hundreds of years before that, everybody in the West all assumed, yeah, the world came into existence one time because God spoke it into existence. There's God, there's the world, two different things, right? The world is not eternal. It had a beginning. But in the late 19th and through close to half of the 20th century, the idea dominated in physics that there must be some way that the world has been around forever. So there were two theories. One was what gets referred to as the steady state theory. The universe has always been pretty much as it is right now, just always. Things do move around, but they move around. They move around stars. There are galaxies. They spin. There are solar systems. The planets spin around the stars in the middle of those solar systems. So there are cycles and cycles and cycles, but the universe has always been there. And we discovered that there were strong indications that couldn't be the case. Things like the redshift that showed us that stars are moving consistently farther and farther and farther away from us and farther apart from each other. The whole thing seems to be expanding. The whole universe is expanding. And that couldn't be reconciled with a steady state theory. And by the way, since it all seemed to be expanding, that indicated that a long time ago it was all very condensed, and so that would seem to point toward a beginning. But we don't want to acknowledge that there's a beginning, because if you acknowledge that there's a beginning, then you have to wonder, well, what brought it about? What created it? And that means you have to appeal to something beyond it. And that leads to Twoism. But if you're a committed oneist, that is, if you are a modernist, if you are an atheist, secularist, you don't want to go there. So what do we come up with? Then we come up with the pulsating universe theory. You remember that? Pulsating universe theory. This tells us that, the universe started off in an explosion, and it's been expanding outward ever since then, but eventually it will get to the point where its velocity has decayed so much that it no longer can escape the gravity that comes from the center of it, and it will begin to implode, and it goes right back toward the center, and it condenses again. And once it becomes sufficiently condensed, then the interaction of the atomic forces causes it to explode again. And for all eternity, this has been going on back and forth and back and forth. There never was a beginning, there never will be an end, but it's a pulsating universe. And then we found some problems with that theory, and I don't remember the physical explanations of the problems with that theory, but we found out, actually I think partly it has to do with that, if I remember correctly, I could have this wrong, but we're not discovering that the velocity of the expansion is deteriorating. If anything, I think we're finding the velocity is increasing over time, which is the opposite of what we expected. But if the velocity is increasing rather than deteriorating, then it's not going to lose its capacity to overcome the force of the gravity at the center. So it won't recondense. So you lose the pulsating universe. So then what are you left with? You're left with the Big Bang theory, which is now the dominant cosmology among physicists. That the universe started with a Big Bang and it's expanding outward. And interestingly enough, where that leads, Isaac Asimov pointed out, one of the great science writers of our age, Isaac Asimov pointed out that where that leads is ultimately to heat death, to maximum entropy for the entire universe, where every atom, indeed not just every atom, but every subatomic particle is so far from any other particle that none of them interacts at all. There is no longer any exchange of energy among them, and everything is at 0 degrees Kelvin, and it's the heat death of the universe, which is not exactly a tremendously encouraging prospect for our future, although of course that doesn't happen for billions of years down the road, and since obviously none of us has a soul, we're not immortal, we won't be around to see that. But it does tend to be a fairly depressing cosmology, right? And I think partly in an attempt to escape that kind of a depressing cosmology, then you get notions like Stephen Hawking's idea of an infinite number of universes in which things happen in an infinite number of optional ways. There are some steady-state universes, there are some pulsating universes, there are some Big Bang universes, there are some universes that have laws of logic, like the ones that seem to prevail in our world, and there are universes with completely different logics, and literally there are an infinite number of universes. Stephen Hawking, one of the great theoretical physicists of our day, has proposed this, and so have a number of others. Is that because there's any evidence from physics for it whatsoever? Absolutely none. It is all pure philosophical speculation. And what motivated Hawking to go there is precisely that if you don't posit multiple universes, indeed an infinite number of universes, then you cannot escape the argument for intelligent design of this world. Because there are too many conditions that prevail in this universe that are of such low mathematical probability, essentially infinitely or infinitesimally small mathematical probability, that unless you had an infinite number of universes, none of them could turn out this way. But this one did turn out this way, therefore we know there must have been an infinite number of universes. Of course, because we've assumed there's no God. You see how his oneism drives him to this amazing theory of multiple universes. And of course, part of the very theory of the multiple universes is that nobody from one universe can observe anything in another universe. So these are by definition unobservable, which makes his entire theory by definition unfalsifiable. And under the standard definition of science, as Karl Popper put it in his work, if a theory is unfalsifiable by any imaginable set of material observations, it's not a scientific theory. So that's kind of where things are, but let's go back to Paul in Romans 1 here. God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. In them. He doesn't say by them, he says in them. So they are without excuse. I'm thinking here that Paul is not meaning that all the things that have been made are without excuse. Rather, it is those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, about whom we just read. They're the ones who are without excuse, because in the things that God made are clearly visible his invisible attributes. For although they knew God, and that's an important point, they actually did know God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. By the way, as we witness to others, we should take wonderful encouragement from that statement, although they knew God. Because we can know that every time we witness to somebody, we're witnessing to somebody who has innate to his own mind the knowledge of God. And he may call God the unknown God, but the truth is that he does know God, because God made him in his image, and as Paul will put it in chapter 2 of Romans, God wrote his law on his heart so that he is without excuse. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God, the transcendent God who is different from his creation, Twoism, right? For images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for, the ESV here has a lie. The Greek is actually for the lie. The definite article is in there. I don't know why the ESV doesn't put it in there, and actually most of the English translations don't put it in there, but Peter has a wonderful discussion in this book, 1 or 2, Seeing a World of Difference, of why it really ought to be translated the lie. He's arguing that Paul has directly in his mind, as he writes this passage, Genesis 3. It's the lie of the serpent out of Genesis 3. You will not surely die, but you will become like God. When we exchange the truth of God for the lie, when we exchange the incorruptible, the immortal God for an image like to men and birds and beasts and four-footed things, corruptible things, we have bitten into the apple, so to speak. We have swallowed the lie that Satan told to our parents. And when we do that, God gives us over to that very kind of thinking. He gives us up to the lusts of our hearts, to impurity. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. An aside, that means that there are honorable passions. That implies that. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now we could spend a long time on just those 2 verses for what they say about the unnaturality of homosexual attraction, of homosexual conduct, right? And the degradation of it. And as Peter points out in his discussion in this book, while Paul does go on in the rest of the chapter to name a whole lot of other sins, and it is therefore clear that those who commit those other sins are no less guilty before God than those who commit these 2 particular sins of the women exchanging the natural use of the man for the woman, and the man exchanging the natural use of the woman for the man. Nonetheless, Paul does focus particular attention here. He spends a particular amount of time specifically describing what they're doing. The implication of it is that they have, in addition to rejecting God as distinct from the world, the Creator, they're rejecting other distinctions too, starting with the most fundamental distinction. Now, it's not that this is where sin begins. It's not that this is the first in a chronological series of sins. It's that Paul starts his discussion here because this is the culmination of it all. This is where the rejection of distinctions, this is where oneism really comes to full flower. It's in the rejection of the distinction between human beings and God, between male and female. I'm going to just real quickly pull up here from my hard drive an article that I did years and years ago. Let's see, because I think it'll help to make some of this sensible as to how useful this focus on whether we recognize distinctions or not can be in our interaction with the surrounding culture. All right, see if this will convert decently. Okay. Well, this is an article that I published in World Magazine back in, I think, about 1987, something like that, called Denial of Distinction, the Roots of Socialism and Sexual Deviance. How are socialism and sexual deviance similar? The article began this way, and I'll read it to you. It's not very long. It's a fairly short article. Is there a connection between socialist doctrine and the homosexual rights movement? This was written back in the late 80s, right? That striking lead to a recent article in World disturbed me. While the article presented clear evidence that there is, in fact, such a connection, it didn't answer another question that automatically presents itself. Why is there a connection between homosexuality and socialism? Why, for instance, did Plato endorse both socialism and homosexuality? Why today do we find that many homosexuals are also socialists? We find the key to an answer to that question in Isaiah 5. There, Isaiah wrote of God and his people Israel, "My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill." The well-beloved is Israel. The well-beloved is God. The vineyard is Israel. And he dug it all around, removed its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower in the midst of it, and hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. Then God himself took over and said of his vineyard, "So now, let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground." Next began a long series of woes. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there is no more room. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink. Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood and sin as if with cart ropes, climaxing in these two great woes. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. A fundamental biblical doctrine revealed here is that there are real, abiding, basic distinctives in this world. Some religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, animism, and Spiritism, believe that all is fundamentally one, that there are no distinctions at the root of reality. Not biblical Christianity. The Bible insists that there are distinctions between church and world. That is why when God's vineyard becomes indistinguishable from the world, from the wild vines around it, he tears down its hedge or wall. He will not permit a false distinction to remain. That is why God insists that evil and good, light and darkness, sweet and bitter, not be confused with each other. To those who deny such distinctions, who say that the church can be like the world, who obscure the distinction between good and evil, to them God says, "Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight," as if to say, they may be wise in their own eyes, but not in mine. I am the judge before whom they must stand. They might overlook distinctions, but I will not. What joins socialism with homosexuality and all forms of sexual perversion? They all run astray, consciously or subconsciously, of the biblical doctrine of fundamental distinctions. Biblical thinking recognizes a distinction between church and world. The church is God's private property, a people for God's own possession, 1 Peter 2:9. And it has a hedge or wall of doctrines and ethics built around it to distinguish it from the world. It must not do what the world does, but must perform God's judgments and statutes in which it finds life, according to Leviticus 18:3-5. Just as the Bible insists that God has property in the church, so it insists in the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," that people have property that must be distinguished from everyone else's property. Socialism denies that distinction, claiming that everything belongs to everyone. In so doing, it breaks down a wall of distinction by which God orders reality, and to avoid chaos, it reverts to another kind of order, totalitarianism. The Bible also insists that property is a just reward for work, not to be divided equally among all people regardless of their contribution to its production. Again, socialism denies this fundamental distinction, insisting on an impossible equality of economic condition. Well, what of sexuality? The Bible insists that God made man male and female, and that the distinction must be upheld. Neither adultery, nor fornication, nor transvestism, nor homosexuality, nor bestiality may be condoned among the people of God. Adultery and fornication deny the distinction between one's spouse and all other members of the opposite sex. Transvestism and homosexuality deny the distinction between male and female. Bestiality, with its religious roots in polytheistic evolutionary doctrines of the origin of the world and mankind, denies the distinction between man and animals. Socialism, sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, and bestiality all have this in common. They attack fundamental distinctions God has built into creation. Where they come into closest ideological contact is in denying the exclusivity of certain relationships. Socialism denies the exclusivity of property as belonging to one person or family and not to others. Distinctions are fundamental to biblical thought. Distinctions of order and chaos, of light and darkness, good and evil, animal and man, female and male, saved and damned, church and world, holy and unholy. So are distinctions of work and sloth, individual and community, private and communal property, freedom and slavery, lawfulness and unlawfulness, variety and uniformity. Each in its own way. Socialism, sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, bestiality denies such distinctions. They rebel against the fundamental orders of God's creation. They must not be countenanced among God's people. So, as Paul is thinking through the implications of oneism, of the denial of the creator-creature distinction, he focuses upon homosexuality because that is like the culmination of it all. It's taking one of the most obvious distinctions, male and female, and rebelling and saying we will not recognize that. Okay, so that's how, although indeed it does appear as one sin among many listed here in this passage, nonetheless it is still represented as sort of the culmination of it all. So we finish the passage. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, remember what that would mean, to acknowledge a sovereign, transcendent creator external to the creation. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness. Okay, we're going down, or do we have a problem happening here? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do that. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, that should be a stern rebuke to those Christians among us who distinguish between the respectable sins and the unrespectable sins. So we will speak with great animus about homosexuality or abortion, but not about gossip and envy and strife and slander and boasting and insolence and disobedience to parents and foolishness. You know, foolishness is sin, right? And faithlessness and heartlessness. You know, those are respectable sins. We should be so rebuked by that. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, heartlessness and gossip, they not only do them but give approval to those who practice them. Now this is Paul's bold, direct confrontation of oneism with twoism. He doesn't beat around the bush. He makes the distinction between the two, oneism and twoism, very, very clear. And then following this, he begins to make the case for the complete failure of all men to live up to the requirements of God, so that that's why the only way they can have justification, the only way they can have righteousness in God's sight, is if God gives it to them, and they must receive it totally by faith. They can't do anything to earn it. All right, now, what we're seeing in the world around us is a neo-pagan resurgence. Jones says in the beginning of his book 1 or 2 here, Seeing a World of Difference, he says, neo-pagans are the darling of a variety of movements. They lead the way in the green movement, in systems of wealth distribution, he could have put "re" at the beginning of that, in planetary programs for social justice, in solutions to supposedly man-made global warming, in interfaith conferences, in the normalization of all sexual expressions, and in the promotion of globalist theories through the United Nations. If you ever get a chance to read his well, actually I didn't bring that one with me, but one of his larger books is called Spirit Wars. And for that matter also, his marvelous book, The God of Sex. That book, for close to 200 pages, which isn't the whole book, for close to 200 pages, just simply looks at the teachings about sex and the practices about sex in oneist religions and in the increasingly oneist secular society around us that has been penetrated, has been totally leavened by the oneist understanding of sexuality. And it's an amazing thing. The depth to which this stuff has permeated our surrounding culture, I know I certainly wasn't remotely aware of it until I read Spirit Wars and The God of Sex. I was just amazed. And then it was like blinders came off my eyes, and I started noticing this stuff all over the place. And that's part of the training that he suggests in this book. He gives assignments. At the end of each chapter, there will be an assignment of, as he always puts it, 1 or 2 things to do. Okay, he is a little wedded to that way. He says, each week of this study, buy a different popular magazine. Pick from a variety of fields: health, sports, family, yoga, etc. Buy an issue of popular magazine, and during the week, browse through the magazine with a highlighter in hand and mark every mention you can find of oneist principles. You will be surprised at the end of the study to see how much you understand about the oneist cultural slide. And it is amazing, since I read those other 2 books by him, when I'm reading standard stuff on the web, I rarely buy magazines, but I read on the web constantly, I'm seeing all over the place stuff where oneism is showing through that I never noticed before. Never noticed. 2 pages later in the same book, the essence of neo-paganism, Jones says, can be summed up in these 2 things. First of all, oneism versus twoism. Neo-paganism is oneism, and Christianity is twoism. And then, secondly, defining spirituality as a combination of social justice and mysticism. That constitutes the essence of the new religious, should be religious, not religions, the new religious paganism. Defining spirituality as a combination of social justice and mysticism. I find it very interesting that he puts it that way. You know, why not talk about, tarot cards? Why not talk about TM? Why not talk about, labyrinth stuff, or crystals, or so many other things in the New Age movement? All of those can be wrapped up in the word mysticism. But why this combining of social justice in here? The term social justice was coined by American progressives in either the 1890s or the first decade, 1900s, okay? The term was coined by the progressives to give them a word to refer to socialist redistribution of wealth that wouldn't instantaneously raise opposition on the part of people that they wanted to persuade to embrace the redistribution of wealth. They had adopted their value for this, their approval of this, from Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. But they knew that in America there was a strong resistance to any language that was clearly Marxist. So they baptized this. They named it something different that sounded so attractive. Social, well, who wants to be antisocial? Justice, who wants to be anti-justice? But in reality, social justice means a redistribution of wealth for the purpose of bringing us closer to an equal distribution of wealth in our society than where we are right now. However equal or unequal we might be, we can always get more equal. So social justice is how we pursue that. Well, why would we do that? Precisely because a oneist worldview tells you that if there are no distinctions between us in terms of fundamental reality, then really none of us deserves to have any more of anything than anybody else has. And we should all share totally equally. Indeed, the distinction between rich and poor is just one of those sad illusions that we use to justify our lack of compassion for the needy. And if we will get over that illusion, we will be glad to redistribute wealth so that our equality with everybody else becomes more obviously seen. Right? So, Oneism is at the very heart of paganism, and at the heart of that also is this notion of social justice. This is why resurgent paganism has such powerful political ramifications, not just spiritual ramifications. Well, I noticed that my time is up for before break. Well, this is my last slide anyway. It's a picture from World Magazine that came out just a few days ago for an article, Going Pagan. Church Army, that's in quotes, a group calling itself that, shows signs of theological compromise in the church. If I remember correctly, the number is some 40,000 members of churches from around Great Britain, all gathered at Stonehenge for a pagan religious festival. And they were proclaiming that this is a part of Christianity. Here's the article, and it's the last thing I'm going to do before we break. And I don't have a particular plan for lecture when we come back, so when we come back we can just simply have discussion. But here's the article, just published a few days ago. It's by Thomas Kidd. Church Army shows signs of theological compromise in the Church of England. Evidence continues to mount that Christianity in Britain, and even belief in God's existence, is on its way toward minority status. In a recent YouGov poll of British young adults, only 25% unequivocally affirmed a belief in God, and 38% said they did not believe in God or any greater spiritual power. Meanwhile, one of the Church of England's recent proposals for attracting the young and unchurched is creating a, quote, pagan church with Christian content. Recent census data revealed that pagans were the 7th largest religious group in the United Kingdom, and that the number of pagans doubled between 2001 and 2011. Atheists have worked to get Britons to stop identifying themselves as Christians on the census, and even larger numbers label themselves Jedi Knights than pagans. A summer solstice gathering at Stonehenge, where more than 20,000, that was the number, more than 20,000 assembled this June, highlights the British pagan spiritual calendar. Naturally, pagans are among the groups that churches might want to evangelize, and Anglicans have hosted Christian information booths at pagan events. But the proposal for a pagan church has raised questions about theological compromise. Steve Hollinghurst, a researcher with the Church Army, an Anglican agency headed by former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, recently told the BBC that he envisioned creating a pagan church where Christianity was very much in the center. The Church Army website describes Hollinghurst as researcher on, quote, themes of contemporary spirituality, the New Age movement, and mind-body-spirit fairs. That's fairs centered on the mind-body-spirit relationship. After British newspapers reported his comments, Hollinghurst posted on his personal blog that there is no actual plan to start a pagan church, even though he thinks that Christians can learn a lot from pagans. He affirmed pagans' frequent criticism of the Christian God as exclusively male. Well, why would he do that? Does Christianity affirm the biblical God as male? No. Masculine, perhaps, but not male. But that's all right. Maybe that's a little too fine a distinction to ask from a church leader. Saying that we as Christians need to acknowledge that and recover our own tradition of the divine feminine. Pagans have also put Christians to shame when it comes to the environment, Hollinghurst argued. He dismissed the idea, however, that he was looking to get pagans to join the Anglican Church. Why isn't he looking to get pagans to join the Anglican Church? Paul would be doing that, right? Well, maybe not the Anglican Church anymore, anyway. So there you go. Paganism infiltrating the church, attracting the church trying to compromise with paganism there in Britain. This is a part of the world that we live in. And if we're going to present the gospel in a way that even is meaningful, let alone attractive, we need to understand the mindset of the people who are very much into this. So right now, let's take a break for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll field questions at that point.
The question is, when Paul wrote Romans 1, I know it was written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but do you think as he was looking around his own context, he was seeing some of those immoral activities increasing, or do you think it was a prophetic, something prophetic he was writing?
I don't know how they could increase from where they were at the time. I mean, all of those immoral activities, including homosexuality, were rampant all over the Roman world of that period. The Emperor Nero was a bisexual who had not only a wife, but also a homosexual lover, and was into bestiality, as a matter of fact. And that was not even looked at askance in the Roman royal court, you know. So I don't think that Paul would say, "Hey, I've noticed an upswing in this stuff." It had dominated the Greek world before the Roman Empire, and then it dominated the Roman world as well. You know, our whole experience leading up to even now has been of a world that was fundamentally transformed, both in depth and in breadth, by the leavening force of Christianity. Not only was homosexuality rampant in Paul's day, all over the Mediterranean world, so also was abortion, so also was euthanasia, slavery was everywhere, slavery through kidnapping, sexual slavery was everywhere. I mean, the things that we're seeing as on the upswing now aren't even reaching the proportions that they were at in those days.
The other question is, if you had 30 seconds to speak to an audience made up of 4 groups that I'll break down for you, how would you use those 30 seconds? 4 audiences would be world leaders. Let's say, for example, a group of former U.S. presidents and Obama. So, world leaders.
To world leaders. I'm torn regarding the first 3 categories that you've given me there. I'm torn because on the one hand, I want to address them in terms of their personal need for salvation in Christ. And so I would want somehow to be able to get across to them the bad news of their sin, the reality of their sin, and the judgment of God that they face. And so, you know, what it would be something akin to Paul's message in Acts 17, ending with God commanding all men everywhere to repent in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Because God will judge all men according to my gospel, in Jesus Christ, whom he has raised from the dead. And so I'd want to get that across to them in terms of their personal need. But in terms of their being world leaders, I'd want to say, somehow I would want to try to to say to them something that could draw them back from being men-fearers and men-pleasers to being God-fearers and God-pleasers in how they craft their policies. And part of being God-fearers in crafting policy is surrounding themselves with wise, godly, experienced advisors who know how to do the art of economics, as stated by Henry Hazlitt in his book Economics in One Lesson, who said that the art of economics is, and this is not an exact quote, but the art of economics is to be able to predict the consequences of a proposed policy, not only in the near term and for a small, carefully defined, intended group of people, but in the long term and for the large group of people, for the whole community, not just nationally, but globally. We have so much policy being adopted in complete refusal to think of the usually very predictable consequences if you simply understand that human beings choices are affected by incentives. People respond to incentives. And every new policy will confront people with a list of incentives. Their behavior will adapt to those incentives. And good economists can tell. They understand how people will respond to incentives. It's actually a fairly simple thing, starting right off with the law of demand, and then the law of supply as well. But the law of demand tells us that as the price of any perceived good falls, consumption of it will rise. As the price of any perceived good rises, consumption will fall. So, for instance, if the price of leisure falls because the government guarantees me a wage whether I work or not, my choice to consume leisure instead of work time will rise. That's a very simple kind of an application, principally, but it needs to be done a whole lot more carefully and a whole lot more widely than it is. And the law of supply says that as the price of a good rises, the supply of it will rise. As the price of a good falls, the supply of it will fall. And so if I'm creating laws that diminish the return on investment in any given productive activity, I know in advance I'm going to dampen that productive activity. Just simply asking the world leaders, think carefully about the consequences of what you're doing, and have people who are scientifically well-informed and economically well-informed advising you on those things. And then do what is wise, not necessarily what is popular. Okay, so there's for the world leaders. Then the next group was the pop culture leaders. I'd say, oh goodness. Would you please think about whether you would want your own kids behaving the way you popularize, either through your behavior or through the people you tend to lionize. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, of Oprah Winfrey type guests, or you have well, maybe you do have an idea just how much influence you have in our culture. But I think you have no idea how much suffering comes into people's lives because they try to live the way you picture. Would you just, again, think about the consequences of what you're saying. Would you learn to deny yourself, take up the cross and follow Jesus? It should go without saying that for all three of the first groups, part of my concern would be to try to get across to them their need for salvation in Christ. Okay, that's it for my words to the pop culture, and I suppose how short that is probably reflects how little I participate in pop culture.
Evangelical or Christian leaders.
Christian leaders.
At a Luzon Congress or some kind of gathering of church leaders.
First and foremost, put the Bible at the very center of everything you set out to do. And go to it for wisdom about every aspect of life. Don't think that it's only about how people get to heaven or how to have a happy family, how to grow a church, something like that. The Bible is God's manual for every aspect of human life. And if you haven't noticed what the Bible teaches about metaphysics, maybe you'd better read it with those questions in mind. If you haven't noticed what it teaches about economics, maybe you better read it with those questions in mind. If you haven't noticed what the Bible teaches about the philosophy of history, about historiography, maybe you better reread it with those questions in mind, and so on. So, number one, put the Bible dead center in everything that you are doing. And don't just skim it, don't just read it lightly, but really carefully exegete everything that you go into. Number two, please understand that the best intentions in the world are worthless for helping people if you don't have actual understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And particularly, I'd say to those who are in development missions, I'd say, I want to lock you in a room and you don't get to come out until you have mastered Brian Fickert and Steve Corbett's book, When Helping Hurts, which is all about, the subtitle is something like, How to Help the Poor Without Hurting Them or Yourself. And Fickert and Corbett have spent a lot of time on the mission field doing development missions, and they give firsthand testimony of the things that they've done that have done far more harm than good. And most of those things that are routine policy for pretty much all the major mission organizations in the world. And we have to stop leading with our hearts. And I'm borrowing language that I don't like here, because I don't like the heart-mind distinction. But we have to stop leading with our emotions and start leading with our minds, with careful analysis of what actually makes a difference. And just because it makes us feel good to do such and such doesn't mean that we're actually helping people. And then in addition, I would want to say to these Christian leaders, if you want to speak out and urge the church to take a position on something, you have a real responsibility to learn the technical details of that issue to a pretty good degree before you do that. I think, immediately of the guys who put together the Evangelical Declaration on the Care of Creation back in the 90s, the Evangelical Climate Initiative in 2005, an Evangelical Declaration on Torture a couple of years after that, who just simply, they had great motives, great motives, but they didn't know the fields about which they were writing. When one student of mine at seminary, Knox Seminary, who was who had been an Army Ranger and done several tours in Afghanistan, and when you go through the training to be an Army Ranger, you go through all sorts of stuff to prepare you for how to deal with torture if you're ever captured. When he read the Evangelical Declaration on Torture, he was furious, saying, whoever wrote this doesn't know anything about torture. It's all well-intended garbage, So if you're gonna speak out and make big public declarations, you have a responsibility to actually learn something about it, and not be like the author of the Evangelical Climate Initiative, who told me just before he debated me about it 6 months after it came out, Cal, in preparing for this debate, I found out that the science on climate change is a whole lot more nuanced than I realized it was when I wrote the declaration. There's no excuse for that. And to them too, as to the world leaders, I would want to say, don't be men-fearers. Fear God. Then, to personal evangelists like EE people around the world, I would say, number one, God bless you. Keep at it. Multiply your activities in that as much as you can. Excuse me. Do as much as you can to understand the trends in our surrounding culture, so that you know the language that you need to speak to be able to communicate with people in the street. But frankly, I would guess that most of those who are doing that on a regular basis are probably a whole lot better at knowing that than I am, because they're getting it firsthand every day. They're out there talking with these people. So I wouldn't have terribly much to say to them other than thanks. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for listening in on this, and I hope that you found it helpful to you. I would just remind you that we could not by any means go over all the different cults of Christianity, let alone the various different cults of other religions or anything like that. And so I would just encourage you to get as much other literature on this as you can, study it, learn about many. And I would particularly want to say to you, thank you so much for your labors on the field, bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ day after day to those who need so much to know him. May the Lord bless you. May he fill you with joy and with deep love and patience and endurance as you serve him.